Hello, and thank you for joining. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US, and you are here for our webinar on data analytics to set policy, evaluate investments, and more. For our topics today, we're going to be have a number of speakers. And first, I'd like to just make introductions. We're going to have Mohini Singh. Mohini is Director of Financial Reporting Policy at the CFA Institute. And she's going to talk a little bit about a case study, an example of how they were able to identify some significant impact of making an accounting change by using XBRL standardized data. We're then going to go to Christine Tan. Christine is the co-founder and chief research officer at Idacity, which is an XBRL powered organization and tool. And then we'll have Pranav Ghai. Pranav is the co-founder and CEO of CalcBench, which is also a data analytics provider powered by XBRL data. We're going to cover some CPE questions during the course of our program today. So for those of you getting CPE, please make sure that you respond to the poll questions that you'll see up on your screen. Record your response, and then we'll be sure to get your certificate to you in the next week or two. As we go through the program, feel free to post questions in the, on the Q&A that you see in the console, and we'll get those questions answered as they come in. So before I turn it over to our speakers today, I just want to talk a little bit about the use of the XBRL standard today. XBRL is a global standard. It is an open, non-proprietary standard. It's used extensively throughout the US and throughout the world. And what you can see here is a listing of the types of standards programs that we have around the world. We have 177 programs in total, and they're broken down into programs by financial regulators, capital markets, business registrars, their tax authority programs, government oversight programs, and then also programs where all reporting entities that must submit data to various regulators called standard business reporting must submit that data in XBRL format. In the United States, the SEC today requires operating companies, mutual funds, and credit rating agencies to submit data in XBRL format. Those programs have been in place since 2009. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, requires banks to submit data in XBRL format. And going forward, the SEC has finalized a rule fairly recently that will require business development companies, closed-end funds, variable annuity and variable life insurance companies also to report their data in XBRL format. And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission recently mandated the use of XBRL for public utilities. That's a program that's going to start starting next year. So lots of XBRL data out there right now, lots of XBRL data to come. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Mohini Singh, Director of Financial Reporting Policy at the CFA Institute, who's going to tell us about how some of this data is being used today. So with that, I will turn it over to Mohini.
Thank you, Michelle. First of all, I just wanted to let you know who we are. CFA Institute is basically a global not-for-profit professional association, and we have more than 173,000 investment analysts and portfolio managers in more than 160 countries. I'm actually a part of the advocacy division within CFA Institute, and we have long supported the structuring of data and the use of technology, as we believe that they can be effectively leveraged to provide the information investors need for their investment decisions and allow investors and analysts to consume information more efficiently. It's one of the reasons that we supported the implementation of EDGAR. We thought that it would help democratize the availability of financial information, as it indeed has. Over the last decade, we've provided similar support to the development of XBRL, including publications such as Extensible Business Reporting Language, a guide for investors. In the same vein, we supported the European Securities and Markets Authority's efforts to establish the European single electronic format. under which, as of 2020, EU companies will provide XBRL financial statements. Apart from advocating for the greater use of XBRL for the benefit of investors, we actually ourselves within CFA Institute use XBRL data in support of our analytical content that we provide policymakers in our comment letters and through our thought leadership pieces. For that purpose, we have in fact purchased tools such as Idacity and CalcBench. We also know that many of the other large data providers that investors use pull XBRL data from the SEC. I think many preparers still believe investors print out their financials and pour over the hard copy. That is generally not how investors primarily consume information. They use structured data and refer to the financials as needed. That is why we advocate for the greater use of structured data in all that we do, tagging of numbers and block tagging textual data. We have been urging standard setters to use the structured data to inform their policy decisions. And it was Pranav, who you're going to hear from later, who's also one of our advisory committee members, who suggested that we should prepare our responses to standard setter and regulatory proposals based on data, not just anecdotal evidence. So exactly how are we using the XBRL data for our analytical work? I thought I'd go through a recent example and tell you about the preparation of our comment letter on goodwill. The FASB, or the Financial Accounting Standards Board, is considering alternatives to existing accounting treatments for goodwill, i.e. amortization over impairment. So our advisory committee members asked if we could include some data on goodwill and goodwill impairments. As I'll discuss, I believe our CFA Institute comment letter demonstrates the value of using structured data to inform debate and support policy decisions. The goodwill proposal has as its premise that the cost of performing the goodwill impairment test exceeds the benefit and that change is needed. The FASB did not, however, conduct an empirical analysis of the cost of performing impairment tests, something that should be relatively straightforward as the costs are discrete and measurable. Furthermore, the FASB did not consider the magnitude of the goodwill balances they would likely put on a schedule to amortize over a 10-year period. We felt it was important to contextualize the size of the goodwill debate. We decided to look at balance sheet data on goodwill, to look at the magnitude of the goodwill that was under debate, and its relative importance to balance sheets of US public companies. Using data from CalcBench that makes extensive use of SEC XBRL filings, we gathered the amount of goodwill for all companies listed in the US, foreign and domestic, and also extracted total assets and equity so we could make comparisons. We then extracted the data for the S&P 500 so we could see the data for this subset. We actually did it really quickly. In a matter of less than an hour, we could see all the companies and the data and begin to think about it analytically. We found that a decision by the FASB to adopt private company accounting for goodwill, i.e. amortization, would result in the write-off over 10 years of 5.6 trillion of assets on the books of US public companies. Yep, 5.6 trillion. More staggering, in fact, is the effect this would have on the S&P 500 companies. With $3.3 trillion in goodwill, the S&P 500 represents nearly 60% of the goodwill of all US public companies. Because goodwill impairments were not tagged separately from all other asset type impairments, it was not possible for us to ascertain precisely the resulting incremental amortization impact. That said, in 2018, asset impairment charges for all public companies were 158 billion, up from 108 billion in 2017 and 104 billion in 2016, due significantly to the 23 billion impairment at GE. At a current impairment amount of approximately 100 to 150 billion, it would take substantially more than 10 years to write off existing goodwill. It would be an annual increase of 400 to 450 billion in amortization and a similar decrease in profits. The change to amortization would result in a substantial reduction in assets and equity, as impairments are not as high as will be amortization. Furthermore, amortization actually distorts performance by improving trends in profitability ratios, such as ROE and ROA, by the simple operation of time as equity and assets will decrease with amortization. So we do not believe the FASB's proposal properly contextualizes the magnitude and implications of a switch to amortization. Data-backed arguments such as this do indeed help inform the debate. Let me quickly go through another example. We also commented on the SEC's proposed rule on amendments to the accelerated filer and large accelerated filer definitions. On March the 12th, the SEC actually adopted the amendments to the definitions, and we were not in favor of that. What the amendments do is they allow companies with a public float of 75 million or more, but less than 700 million, and with revenues of less than 100 million to be exempted from the Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404B requirement. What does that mean? It means that certain smaller reporting companies now qualify as non-accelerated filers, and they are no longer subject to auditor attestation of ICFR or internal controls over financial reporting. The SEC's belief is that the cost savings will lead to greater capital formation. Investors, however, are concerned that companies of this size are particularly prone to accounting issues. Indeed, the benefits of focusing on ICFR are more pronounced for smaller companies. Research has shown that the risk of material restatement is higher at these smaller companies. But again, we looked at the data so we could ascertain what the impact would be. And what did we find? The most affected industry, financial services. Based upon our analysis, the industry that will benefit most from the ICFR audit exemption would be the financial services industry. 167 small financial institutions with 33 billion in public float, 9.3 billion in revenue, and 236 billion of total assets will be excluded from the auditor ICFR attestation. We think that the SEC must reconsider whether such depository institutions should be exempt from the requirement, given that A, the 2008 financial crisis, we found that there was not sufficient focus on impairment of assets, and B, the PCAOB's 2018 preliminary inspection findings that show loan impairments remain a key inspection finding. So to conclude, policymakers should use data while making policy decisions. We encourage policymakers to use XBRL data for their own analysis, as well as to provide data sets to their constituents as part of their consultation process. Providing the data set should become a standard protocol in an era where the SEC has substantial XBRL data. Thank you very much for your time.
Mohini, thank you very much. Appreciate the insights into how the data can be used for standard setting. I now want to turn to Christine Tan. Christine is co-founder and chief research officer at Idacity. Christine, I'm going to stop sharing and let you pick up and start sharing your screen.
Great, thanks, Michelle. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, thanks so much, everyone. As Michelle said, my name is Christine Tan. I am the co-founder and chief research officer of Idacity. I co-founded Idacity with Emily Huang, who is the CEO. Previously, Emily co-founded Rivet Software, which is a company that provided software and services to public companies, basically to help them file their Ks and Qs with the SEC using XBRL. My background is in the XBRL data modeling and accounting, and I was part of the core team at XBRL US and the SEC that built the first taxonomy. After that, I went over to the FASB, where I headed up the XBRL team to update and maintain the taxonomy for its annual release to the public. That is where I met Leslie Seidman, who at the time was a FASB board member and later became chairman of the board. Leslie is currently on the board of directors at Moody's and also at GE, and is also our lead advisor. So collectively, on the Idacity team, we have close to 70 years of XBRL experience. Move to the next slide. So basically, the problem set that we're solving is that collecting data from public company filings is a very manual process. Obviously, it's time consuming, it's inconsistent, and often lacks traceability. So at Idacity, we process financial and non-financial data literally within minutes of a filing that is submitted to the SEC. And more importantly, we provide traceability, which allows the data consumers to trace every single data point back to its source location within the filing. So in terms of the Idacity data process flow, essentially our foundation is based on structured data tagged using XBRL. Then because of our XBRL expertise and domain knowledge, we are able to use the XBRL technology and framework to quote unquote XBRLize other unstructured documents and data to structure them. So this leads us to our first use case. We currently have a large investment bank that collects detailed data from closed-end mutual funds financial statements. Obviously, these financial statements are not tagged in XBRL. We use our technology to essentially auto-tag the data and deliver the data to them using our API. We use machine learning and our proprietary algorithms to normalize data and text, and this gives rise to the second use case. We have public companies that want to be notified when peer companies and other companies make certain disclosures. So for instance, during this very challenging time, companies are trying to figure out how they should be disclosing the impact of COVID-19 on their operations. These companies want to research how and what other companies are disclosing. So we are able to notify them as soon as any company submits a filing to the SEC that mentions COVID-19 and its impact on the company's operations. Now, of course, after processing and normalizing the XBRL and non-XBRL data and text, we deliver the data in a variety of ways that meet the customer's specific needs and use cases. So for instance, we have a large data aggregator who calls a large volume of data through our API. We deliver the data and all of the metadata for the traceback to the source location so that this large data aggregator can integrate the data into downstream within the applications and products. Now, essentially the problem that we solve for them is that they used to spend 10 to 12 days manually collecting and normalizing this data. And now using our API, they get the data which has gone through our own internal validations and checks, and they get this data literally within 2 hours with all of the quality checks already conducted. So another use case is we also have another investment bank who uses our data to analyze in detail the footnotes. And in particular, there's been a lot of interest surrounding the pension footnote. So basically this investment bank, they download the data into a CSV file, but they also have the ability to use our API user interface to see the traceback to the source location so that they can do their own data validations and quality checks as well. So here are a couple of use cases. So I'm going to skip through a couple of these next cards and kind of show you how you can possibly use Idacity. So as I said before, we have different ways that we deliver the data to end users. We have these modules. Basically, the first one is the Company Explorer. We provide standardized financial statements so you can benchmark companies side by side. As I mentioned, we have an API. The API provides real-time integration with the customer's workflow. We have our Idacity tagging application. As I mentioned before, we're able to leverage the XBRL technology and framework to go ahead and structure unstructured data and text currently. And so there's a lot of interest surrounding non-GAAP data and ESG data. That's the kind of data that we can now go ahead and auto tag using our application. We have a research module. This allows companies and investors to basically conduct real-time searches on financial and textual disclosures. We have a module that is called Idacity Analysis. And this basically offers users the ability to visualize the data and interact with it in real-time basis. And then finally, we have an inline XBRL viewer. This application allows companies to essentially do the quality checks and validations before they submit their filings to the SEC. So now for the remainder of my presentation, I'm going to show you how you can interact with the data and also some of the use cases I just discussed. So if I go to the next card. So here is an example of a textual search. This basically pulls up all companies' earnings releases that mentions COVID-19 and its impact on the earnings or operations of the company. Now, if I unfilter this, you can see that there's a whole close to 1,000 companies that have already mentioned in this filing season COVID-19 and its impact on its operations. So if I say click on GE, you can see that once I click on GE, the middle pane pulls up the GE earnings release. And on the right-hand side here, you can see the highlights of within the body of this text here where COVID-19 is mentioned. So if I click on, say, highlight 2, it'll take me directly to the location within the text. And the font may be a little bit too small for you to see, but it takes you directly within the text of this GE's earnings release where they discuss COVID-19 and its impact on operations. And basically, I can do that for any company, right? So I can click on, say, this company, NCR, again, shows all the highlights here. Anything that you're interested in, you can click on the highlight and it'll take you directly into the body of the text. And what's nice about this card is that this is a live card, which means that you don't have to continue to do this search and create the search parameters. As soon as any filing or any earnings release in this case hits the SEC's wires, this card will automatically update, the number will update, it will show you the latest filings that mention COVID-19 and its impact on the earnings and operations of the company. And users can also subscribe to notifications, so they'll get a push notification. You'll get an email saying, hey, 5 companies today, and here are the 5 companies that mention COVID-19 and the impact on operations. So you'll be notified as opposed to having to constantly, conduct a search. So that's one way that you can kind of leverage XBRL technology to be able to do textual searches. The next example is where you can see here, this is a common size income statement. You're benchmarking Pfizer as the primary company against 7 of its peer companies on all of these KPIs here that basically form the line items in a common size income statement. What's nice about this is that, because of the interactivity nature of XBRL data, you can interact with the data on the fly. So I can go from Pfizer and maybe switch over to, say, Abbott Laboratories, and literally the graph will update instantaneously. So now I can compare Abbott Laboratories against the median for the 7 peer companies. And you can do that with any company that is on this list here. Similarly, here is another example where I'm comparing Bristol Myers to 7 of its peer company groups, looking at R&D as percentage of revenues. I can simply click on revenues and it'll update in real time. If I wanted to compare Bristol Myers to, or if I actually wanted to compare, say, Pfizer to the peer group based on revenues, you can do that as well. I can go from the median for the peer group to average, and you can see that the graph will update slightly. Again, I think this highlights the fact that with XBRL data, because it is essentially real time and it's structured, you can interact with the data on the fly. You can go along and ask questions along the way as you see interesting patterns and drill into the data. The next example is here. We've got a comparison of GAAP to non-GAAP data. So this is a graph, a time series graph for Merck. Let's say I don't want to see revenues on this graph. I can simply deselect that, and you can see that the graph will update to showcase the congruence or incongruence between net income and net income non-GAAP. Now, as all of you know, the non-GAAP data, that's not being required to be tagged in XBRL right now. So what we do is, as I said before, we leverage our XBRL technology and framework to go ahead and auto tag this data that is currently disclosed in the MD&A or in the earnings release. What's nice about this is as I mentioned before, we provide traceability, right, back to the source location. So if I click on this little arrow up here to flip the card around, I can actually see the data here, right? And so here, the data is for net income, non-GAAP. If I am curious about where this 13.4 billion came from for 2019, I simply click on that, and it'll take me back to the actual earnings release for Merck, where this number, the 13.4 billion, was auto tagged, and you can see that this is the non-GAAP amount for net income. And we do that for every single data point. Again, with a simple click of a button, we'll take you back to the exact source location within the document itself. Moving on to the next example. I think this example really illustrates the power of XBRL data in terms of the ability to get really, really granular data. So the use case that Mohini mentioned, talking about goodwill and impairments, some of that data is disclosed in the footnotes. It's buried in the footnotes. And so with XBRL, it really surfaces all of that data to the forefront. So it's very easy for you to be able to access that data. So here's an example of 3 pharmaceutical companies. I'm going to click on the drill down here, and I'm going to click on this little icon here. Now, once I click on that, you can now see literally within a few clicks of a button, the revenues by segmented by geography for the 3 companies. And not only that, I can kind of hover over a certain data point. It'll give me a nice little time series for that. But as I said, the interactivity nature of the data lends itself to the user to be able to ask questions along the way. So if I'm curious to see the drugs for Eli Lilly in the US, I can look at the drug revenues here and see the time series trend for any drug revenue that the company discloses. And again, you can deselect geography and say, look at products and services and maybe segments if you wanted to, side by side. You can now look at the 3 pharmaceutical companies and look at their drug products and services and segments breakdown. I can deselect Bristol Myers, deselect Eli Lilly. I can expand Pfizer here and sort of drill into the different sort of breakdowns for revenues. So I think the takeaway from this is, with XBRL, any granular piece of data that is disclosed in the footnotes is easily accessible. Before I actually go into this, I'm going to quickly show you our interface with the API, which illustrates the use cases which I mentioned before. So here is a little sandbox that I put together. This is an API interface that we built to allow our large customers who pull a lot of data from us through our API to be able to do some QA and data analysis on their end as well, once they pull the data. So I'm going to select BlackRock Income Trust. So this is a closed-end mutual fund. When I click on that, you've got the repurchase financing, reverse repurchase financing amount. If I click on the little blue button, it's going to take me to this company's or the closed-end mutual fund's financial statements. So there is an example of where none of this in the closed-end mutual fund's financial statements is being tagged by the fund itself in XBRL. We're able to leverage that XBRL technology, again, as I said, to go ahead and auto tag each and every single data point here and show all the metadata pertaining to this given fact. And you can see there's a lot of detail in here, which is very valuable. So that's one example of how we're able to auto tag currently data that is unstructured. Another example, if I go back to the main page, so if we look at GE, This also illustrates the point that if I click on the little blue button here for commercial paper, right, you can see that it will take us directly into the footnotes for GE and point out or pull up commercial paper, right? And similarly for the use case I talked about where you've got that investment bank that wants to get detailed pension data, if I click on this little blue icon here, you'll be able to get the asset allocation for that particular pension data. So again, the takeaway is XBRL data is very powerful. And hopefully from what you've seen here, you can see that you can get very easily up-to-date information. You can work with the data in the way that you'd like to, whether it's through an API or whether you want to visualize the data or do textual searches. You can uncover rich insights, especially with push notifications to you, and you get to analyze the data that you need. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Michelle, and stop sharing.
Christine, thank you very much. We have a couple of questions for you before we go on to some CPE questions. The first one, can you provide some color about how you normalize non-XBRL data for publicly traded operating companies? Are you doing any work around MD&A?
Yes, so we do that. So the one example I showed you, actually the two examples I showed you, where I was able to show you that the non-GAAP data that we got for Merck, right? And that particular data point came from an earnings release, but we can certainly, what we auto tag in the earnings release, we can auto tag in the MD&A. In fact, we currently auto tag, the proxy statements to get audit fee data because there's some interest in getting audit fee and the breakdown of the fees that companies pay their accountants. So that's that. And the second example I showed you was the BlackRock, the closed-end mutual fund. Again, that is coming from a financial statement that is not being tagged in XBRL. And we can apply the auto tagging methodology to go and quote unquote to auto, to grab that data. Whether it's the MD&A, the earnings release, or the closed-end mutual fund financial statement, we can basically auto tag any of that data. Make sense?
Okay, great. And one last question for you. Can the visualizations that you've been showing be exported to PDF or some other medium to send in email?
Absolutely. I didn't get a chance to show you, but there's always a little download button that you can download any data that you want, because we recognize that as accountants or folks who work in finance and accounting love their Excel spreadsheets. So we offer you multiple ways to access the data. So if you prefer to analyze the data within a spreadsheet, you can absolutely download any of that data.
That's great. And then, okay, one last question actually. Since extensions are allowed, not all companies may use the same tag. How do you ensure that such figures are comparable?
So we apply our own proprietary algorithms to normalize the tags. And even if companies use the US GAAP elements, as most of you know, within the taxonomy, there might be, potentially very similar revenue tags, for instance, right? And so as soon as a company A uses revenue tag number 1 and company B uses revenue tag number 2, if you don't normalize it, you can't really compare A and B, companies A and B. So we apply our proprietary algorithms to normalize that, which includes extensions. So, at the end of the day, what's important for us is we show transparency. So while we go ahead and normalize the tags into what we call KPIs, if you wanted to, just as you wanted to see where the data came from, you could flip the card around and see exactly what tag they use. So for all the XBRL data geeks out there who are interested in the actual tag being used, you can see that if you wanted to.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's go to some poll questions now. For those of you who are getting CPE, and I'm going to launch the first poll. Okay, so the question here is a recent CFA Institute analysis using XBRL data. This is actually the analysis that Mohini mentioned in her talk, showed that a proposed FASB accounting treatment change to goodwill could result in reducing profits for US public companies over a 10-year period by how much? By $560 billion, $330 billion, or $330 million. So I'll give you like another 30 seconds here. Just click on the button that seems most appropriate. Okay, just another 10 seconds or so. Okay, I'm going to shut down the poll here. And we'll go to our second question. Okay, the Securities Exchange Commission requires certain reporting entities to submit data in standardized XBRL format. Which kinds of companies are required to report in XBRL format today? Operating companies, mutual fund companies, and credit rating agencies, or operating companies, mutual fund companies, credit rating agencies, and variable annuity companies, or operating companies, mutual fund companies, credit rating agencies, variable annuity companies, and business development companies. Which ones are required to report in XBRL today? Okay, just another 15 seconds or so here. All right, I'm going to close down our poll. All right, thanks everybody for responding. And we're now going to turn to our next speaker, Pranav Ghai. Pranav is co-founder and CEO of CalcBench. Pranav? And I guess I will stop sharing my screen so you can start sharing.
No problem. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
So let me share my screen now. And like most of you, I'm operating from my home environment on what I hope is a stable internet connection. So if it happens to go out, I'll keep talking, but you guys won't hear me. Okay, here we go. So what do we do at CalcBench? So we started the company, just a little bit of background, 2011, late 2011, early 2012. Alex Rapp and I decided that we would use a lot of the data that our good friend Campbell Pride and his team at XBRL US were putting out, and CalcBench was born. Prior to starting CalcBench, we worked at a combination of hedge funds and banks, building models, managing money, all of that stuff. So we knew a lot of the sort of legacy providers, in the sense that, like, the Capital IQs, the FactSets of the world. We used a lot of those data sets to build our own models. And so we knew sort of the pitfalls, the advantages of using each of those things. And we set out to design a company that, used our experience to help people build and use the data that was now literally being available at their fingertips. So we started small, built the business up, and now we've been operating for 7 or 8 years. And it's been a lot of fun. We've learned a tremendous amount. These are some of our clients who will go on the record and talk to you about us and how they use our data. What are some of the things that you get out of XBRL? A lot of you know that this the granularity is unparalleled. So it's the big data vendors make data sort of fit a template. They don't necessarily allow the company detail as it was filed by the firm to be shown. XBRL lets you do that. It also lets you do peer comparisons. You can do all kinds of neat disclosure queries, as Christine showed you. Comparing, the example I like to give, and I'll show you a few of these examples, but you can go literally down into an income tax footnote, for example, and pull out an R&D tax credit. And then you can say, what does that R&D tax credit look across a particular industry or across a sample of the S&P 500 or the Russell 1000, whatever it is. And you can do that very, very quickly. Historically, pivoting like that with a data set just hasn't been, even with the big data vendors, it's not something you can do rather easily. Here, you can do it very, very quickly and have transparency into how that metric was formed. So again, some of the key benefits here, you can take as reported line item detail, spread it out over time. It sounds simple. It's actually not that simple, believe it or not. What else can you do? You can reduce manual entry. Vendors have Excel plugins. We've got our own. You can use programming interfaces to get involved with the data as well. We have clients that do that. Traceability, as Christine mentioned before, this is a big deal. It isn't just that I used to work at Morgan Stanley. We called it metric transparency back then. We call it traceability now. What does it mean? It simply means that when you deliver a number to a client, that client ought to be able to literally with a mouse click find out where that came from. And bang, you should be able to do that very, very quickly. Today we can. Deltas. Deltas exist not only in numbers from period over period, quarter over quarter, year over year, they also exist in text. So you can do these kinds of comparisons very, very easily. Look at how an accounting policy changed from 2018 to 2019. Those kinds of things makes the analysis much easier. And you don't have to do it on an entire document. You can do it on a piece of the document, and that's really critical. So with all the metadata around financial statements, you can actually just look at an income tax disclosure and compare it to the prior year, not just with numbers, with text as well. You can also search earnings press releases, looking for all kinds of things inside that. The non-GAAP reconciliation, ESG information, whatever you want. And then over here, these are just some simple examples. These are some firms that have used our data in the past to inform their own analysis. This is a Wall Street Journal. Every couple of months, we're lucky enough to have something published in there. This is from Morgan Stanley piece a few years ago from the sell side. They publish a lot, et cetera, et cetera. These are other case studies. I'm happy to send this publication out to you guys if you want it. Just ask. And with that, I'm just going to go very, very quickly into a demo over here. I'll show you guys. This is the website. You can come in. We've been publishing a lot of stuff on our blog as of late. You can just click on any of these use cases, and it'll take you to it. A couple of them that we have are here, and this is one on corporate reporting. I'm just going to pull up here. This was published earlier this month. This is a publicly traded company that uses CalcBench and what they do with it. And so there's just a Q&A. It's called a Q&A using CalcBench for corporate reporting, published on April 3rd. I won't bore you with the details, but for a number of you, if you're looking to see how people use it, this is anonymized. This is it. So typically for comparison purposes, you can drop things directly into a board presentation, for example, on peers, what have you. Lastly, let me just show you, I don't want to take too much of the time, but I'm going to show you a really simple template that we built up in Excel. And this was based on, we noticed that provision for loan losses in banks had ticked up in the most recent reporting period. So we just went and said, okay, if we look at the provision for loan loss as a percentage of net interest income and do that ratio across big banks for as many periods as we can get, what does that look like? So you can actually build a formula that looks like this right there. So this is a ratio, and in that ratio, sorry about that, it just takes, it's got the numerator and it says, okay, I'm going to call provision for loan loss with my other parameters, the company identifier, the period that you're in, et cetera. And I'm going to put that over the net interest. I think I may have lost my mic there for a second anyway. So
Second, you're back.
I'm back. Okay. So anyway, this is a time series. Bang, you can just do this and it doesn't take very long. And then over here, all the way on the end is the first quarter of 2020. And you can just eyeball this and look at some of these. Now, the reason COF, that's capital one, that's the one I'm waiting for. They're particularly high. So you can assume that this current quarter, they're going to go up to like 45, 50, 60%, who knows? And then just build a chart and see what it looks like. And so this blew us away. So this is the ratio over time, the blue line, and you can see that it's more than doubled for the current period. And we only have right now 14 firms that have reported out of, the universe of 20 some odd. And these are things that you can do, on the fly, literally. So this is what it allows you to do. And, this is typically where I stop and ask people for questions or whatever it is. So if I have a minute, I can show you where that goodwill number that Mohini talked about came from, if you guys want. And
Pranav, we do have a couple of questions.
Oh, sure, shoot.
So the first question, how is foreign currency translation gain or loss treated in XBRL financial applications, since XBRL is used globally? I don't know if there's a way of handling that, because right now you're looking really just at US data, correct? So
yeah, we are looking at mostly US data. It's I mean, there are some IFRS filers in here. It's not something that for me has come up very often, primarily because this is a US based tool. And we do some simple things about, we do some simple divisions and things like that with respect to foreign currency. And there are a few tags for foreign currency translation gain loss, but not so much, I'm probably not the expert here in that case. But if somebody else wants to jump in and take that.
I just wondered if maybe that'll change with,
oh, sorry. Yeah.
With a lot of the ESMA data coming in.
Yeah.
Which is, just starting this year, because, starting this year, European Union countries are requiring all of the companies within their jurisdiction to report using XBRL as well, using the IFRS taxonomy. And so, that program is really just getting started this year. So there will be a lot more data, and maybe that'll be something that's handled there.
Yeah.
Another question we got is, where was the loan loss provision pulled from for Q1 data?
Yeah, so that comes, a lot of it came from 8K earnings press releases. Some of it came from the Qs that were filed. That's it. It's a MASH. I think that's the technical term, MASH.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. But you can trace it back and figure out where it came from.
Right. And we have another question about comparing across countries. And I think once we see more of that, IFRS data from European Union companies, does CalcBench intend to add those into the database going forward, or? Do you have any plans for that?
To add,
ESMA data that's going to be coming in.
we would love to. I mean, the short answer there is, I think all of us want more data, more international information. The easy thing, however, is to say you want it. The hard thing is to actually start implementing it so that
Right.
people can draw meaningful conclusions from data. It's, you know, there are, the more you look at this stuff, the more you realize how the subtleties, the gotchas, reporting periods are different. You know, you're going to have to look at the different, the taxonomies are different. And the meaning of the elements, even if they look the same, may actually be very different. So you have to be very, very careful. And then, so part of the, I exercise a lot of caution with that because when you start having, you have clients who actually, you know, are making money management decisions based on this, you have to be very, you know, that's a whole level of, it's a whole level of scrutiny that you're under, that you want to be, you have to be sort of doubly and triply careful with that.
May
So,
I add to that, Michelle?
Yeah, of course.
Of course, for our own analysis, I mean, you know, we comment on proposals that come out of Europe, and we would love to have that data to analyze. And of course, ESMA, the European Securities and Markets Authority, has asked for XBRL filings as of this year. But one of the issues that they have in Europe is they don't have an Edgar-like database set up so that we can access that data easily. And in fact, that's one of the things that we've been writing to Commissioner Dombrovskis about at the European Commission.
Yeah, that's right. That makes it even a bit more challenging.
Absolutely.
And I think, you know, to Pranav's point about, you know, the data, the raw XBRL data is like extremely granular, extremely useful, but it does require some work to get it to a point where it's very easy to compare across companies and across countries. And so that's where, you know, the value of, you know, tools like CalcBench and Idacity really come into play. And that's where it also opens up opportunities for, you know, so many more companies that provide, you know, analytical offerings, because, you know, this data is freely available, it's highly granular, but there's, you know, so much more value add that can be incorporated to make, you know, interesting, useful, very visual tools like the ones that we've been looking at today. One other question that we got is, and this is, you know, for anybody on the panel, how do you calculate industry averages using XBRL? That seems like a relatively straightforward practice, but maybe, you know, maybe one of you guys could respond to that one.
So that's a very fair question. There's no, I don't know if there's necessarily if there is a standard for that. You might want to market weigh those. So some people would do a market cap weighted standard. We prefer to just look at a median because one of the things that or I mean, you know, you can do a common size thing where you take all the income statement items and deflate by revenue, for example. So we do a lot of that, but I don't know necessarily that there's one particular way of doing something like that. So the point that I'd like to make on that is, you know, when you do something like you say, okay, I want to look at General Electric versus its peer group, you pick the right company and you pick the right peer group. To me, that's a very, very critical step to this whole thing. So you want to make sure that, you know, it is as apples to apples as it can be. But I don't necessarily know that there's one size that fits all there. The key thing as a data vendor is to give people as many choices as possible so they can, you know, they can do their own thing.
And Christine here. I completely underscore what Pranav said. So the key thing here is, you want to give the end consumer different ways to do the analysis, whether they want to aggregate by industry using SIC code or NAICS, or as Pranav pointed out, if you want to benchmark yourself against other companies that you want to benchmark against, it doesn't necessarily have to be in your industry group. You can, basically select your peer companies. And what we do at Idacity is, whatever peer company groups that you want to benchmark against, we'll go ahead and calculate the average or the median for that group of companies.
Right, because there could be different parameters that you're
Exactly.
looking at beyond industry. You might be looking at size, geography.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, all kinds of things. And the cool thing about the XBRL data is that because it is so easy to manipulate, it kind of makes it a lot easier to do.
Right. And I think importantly, like if you look at even at the segment footnote, some companies don't want to benchmark at the corporate, at the consolidated level. They want to, benchmark based on segments, right? I want to benchmark my, biotech segment against your biotech segment, right? So you can even do that level of, granularity in terms of benchmarking.
Right, exactly. And another question, is it possible to compare 10K and 20F filings? And maybe just, in both of your tools?
Sure, we do that. And sort of Pranav discussed this before in terms of, we do have IFRS filers in the US, the 20F filers. And so basically we, again, normalize and compare. So like if they use the IFRS tag for revenues, we would normalize that to our revenue KPI. And again, as Pranav pointed out, sometimes it's not a one-to-one mapping between a US GAAP element and IFRS element. And because the reporting frameworks are very different, we do our best to normalize it. And again, we just basically, if users are interested in how an IFRS line item is being tagged and compared to a US equivalent line item, they can always, flip the card around and see what tags are being used by the company.
Right. Okay. I think we've gotten to all the questions here. I'm just glancing through them. Just one question, and Pranav, I think this is just very specific about CalcBench. It says, I see the S&P 500 is the list dynamic. Say I want to look at the S&P 500 in 2018, or will it always show the list as on date?
It is a current list.
Okay.
So this was another, back in my quant days, I would have probably dinged me for this, and that's being polite. So there are those, and I'm sure Idacity does it the same way. Nobody here throws any data out. If the question was sort of a, hey, I want to back test and I want to be able to say that my data is not either being biased by a look ahead bias or has survivor bias, can you guarantee that? And the short answer is no one can really guarantee that, but we do the best we can. So if you've got a list of symbols that go back over time and you'd like to put that into CalcBench, we will accept it and return data for the period in which the company was alive. But there are even complications beyond that the XBRL data exposes. And one of those things is, it's a very simple thing. You get a filing on a particular day, and that filing has historical information in it. And you can get revisions in this data. And I'm not talking about an amended filing. I'm talking about little r's, little revisions. And Christine's talked about this for a long time. You see this stuff, and so you need to basically you need to have rigorous point in time functionality to backtest. And if the person who asked the question wasn't going to backtesting, I apologize. But the point is that, you know, each of these data points has metadata, and it has things like timestamps, and there are multiple timestamps. When the data came in, when the data was, the point in time when the data was referencing, for example, full year 2018, all of these things matter, and it's kind of like piecing together a puzzle. But, you know, the data vendors are here to sort of help you put that puzzle together. So long answer. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. That's great. That's great. So let's, we're kind of at the end of our time here. So I want to go ahead and do our poll questions. And thanks everybody for all of your questions. And thanks very much, Mohini and Pranav and Christine, for your presentations. Those are great. It's really interesting to hear about different case studies, different examples of using XBRL data to kind of improve the process. So I'm going to share my screen here. And sorry, bear with me a second. I've got a lot of stuff going on. Actually, let me just pull up the poll questions. Okay, so the first poll question we have here: which U.S. government agencies have mandated that certain reporting entities provide their financial data in standardized XBRL format? Is it the Securities and Exchange Commission? Is it both the SEC and the FDIC? Or is it the SEC, the FDIC, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the FERC? Okay, so we'll just give another 15 seconds or so here. Okay, I'm going to end the polling and we'll bring up our last poll. Okay, so how many XBRL programs are in place worldwide? Is it 100, 177, or is it 200 XBRL programs in place around the world? Okay, we'll just take another 20 or 30 seconds here. Okay, just another 10 seconds and we'll be closing down the polling. Okay, I'm gonna shut that one down. And I'm having a problem with my screen. Now my screen seems to be a little frozen there. So apologies for that. I'm going to stop sharing. But I want to thank everyone very much for attending the session today. And we do have a couple of webinars coming up in May that actually focus on phase 2 filers that will be implementing inline XBRL and cover page tagging. So please look for those in your inbox and get those on your calendar. And again, thanks very much for the CFA Institute for helping us to promote this event. And thank you for Mohini Singh, Pranav Gai, and Christine Tan for telling us a bit more about how people use XBRL data today. So thanks again, and we'll see you in our next webinar next month. Thank you.